Life is just a game, and you're finally learning the rules. Hello, and welcome to Veronica's Journal, where we discuss spirituality, psychology, and mental health. Here, we evolve as a community that's unstoppable. My name is Veronica. Hope you're all doing well. How's it going, guys? So today, we'll be diving deep into the topic of, drumroll please, life. What if the biggest illusion in life is the one almost everyone agrees to? The illusion that you're only this body, this name, this personality, this role you've been performing since childhood. Because from the moment you entered this world, people started handing you identities before you even knew how to think for yourself. Isn't that true? This is who you are. This is who you should become. This is success. This is failure. This is attractive. This is embarrassing. This deserves love. This deserves rejection. And slowly, without realizing it, most people begin building themselves out of borrowed ideas, borrowed fears, borrowed beliefs, borrowed ambitions. And after years of performing this version of themselves, they forget there was ever anything underneath the performance at all. Now that's the game. That's the illusion. Not that life is fake, but that most people never truly meet themselves beneath the conditioning, you know? And you can feel when the illusion starts cracking because something inside you becomes restless. You start questioning things you used to blindly accept. You look around the world and you think, why does everybody seem spiritually exhausted? Why does everyone look anxious, disconnected, emotionally numb? Why do so many people feel empty, even after getting everything they thought they wanted? Because people are chasing symbols instead of meaning, titles instead of purpose, validation instead of connection, applause instead of peace. And the strange part is, society rewards this. The more disconnected people become from themselves, the more successful they appear on the surface. It's true. Like busy, productive, entertaining, smiling for photos while internally falling apart. And eventually, some people hit the wall where they can't do it anymore. The mask starts suffocating them. The life they built no longer feels aligned with their soul. And this is where usually the awakening begins. Not in comfort, not when you're certain. It's usually through exhaustion, heartbreak, isolation, loss, betrayal, identity collapse. Moments where reality hits so hard that the old version of you just can't survive it anymore. Because awakening isn't always beautiful at first. Sometimes it feels like grief. Grief for the person you pretended to be. Grief for the years you spent abandoning yourself, just trying to fit into systems that were never designed for your spirit in the first place. You know? And one of the loneliest feelings in the world is realizing you can no longer unsee what you now see. And once you notice the game, you start seeing it everywhere. You notice how fear drives entire systems. Fear keeps people obedient. Fear keeps people distracted. Fear keeps people buying things they don't need, proving things they shouldn't have to, chasing approval from people who don't even love themselves, you know? And when fear becomes normalized, people mistake survival mode for personality. They think anxiety is just who they are. They think overworking is ambition. They think emotional suppression is strength. They think constant self-sacrifice is love. But a lot of what society praises is actually unresolved trauma functioning efficiently. Think about how many people were taught that their worth depends on what they produce, not who they are, what they can do, how useful they are, how attractive they are, how agreeable they are, how profitable they are. And if you grow up in that environment long enough, you start believing love must be earned through performance. And that's why so many people feel exhausted all the time. They're not just living, they're constantly auditioning, auditioning for acceptance, auditioning for relevance, auditioning for permission to finally feel enough. And the game never ends because external validation can never permanently heal an internal wound. That's why someone can have all the money they want and still feel empty, have all the fame and still feel unseen, have all the relationships and still feel alone. Because the illusion has convinced the people that fulfillment exists outside of themselves. When real peace usually begins the moment you stop abandoning yourself for approval. And maybe that's why some of the most dangerous people in the system are the ones who begin thinking independently for themselves. The ones who stop blindly following social programming. The ones who start questioning narratives instead of automatically absorbing them. Because conscious people are harder to manipulate. Once someone realizes they don't need constant validation to exist, the game loses part of its control over them. Once someone stops defining themselves by status, comparison becomes less powerful. When someone stops fearing rejection, people lose the ability to emotionally control them through shame. And this is where life becomes strange at first, because awakening doesn't necessarily remove pain. It changes your relationship with it. You start understanding that suffering often becomes the doorway to deeper awareness. Not because pain is glamorous, but because pain strips illusions. It forces honesty. It forces reflection. It forces transformation. You know, some of the deepest people you'll ever meet became deep because life shattered the superficial version of their reality they once believed in. Betrayal taught them discernment. Loneliness taught them self-reliance. Rejection taught them authenticity. Loss taught them presence. And eventually they stopped asking, why is this happening to me? And they begin asking, what is this trying to teach me? And that shift changes everything. Because now life stops being random punishment and it starts becoming a mirror instead, a teacher, a spiritual classroom. And suddenly you realize every relationship reveals something about you. Every trigger reveals something unhealed. Every attachment reveals something you fear losing. Every emotional reaction reveals something deeper underneath the surface. And this is why shadow work becomes unavoidable for people who truly wake up. I have a whole video on it. Check it out. Because eventually you realize the external world reflects the internal world more than you originally ever thought. You know, the ego hates to hear that. The ego wants villains and victims. The ego wants to be certain and feel superior. But awakening humbles people because they begin realizing how much of their suffering came from unconscious patterns running in the background. You know, childhood wounds, fear of abandonment, fear of not being enough, fear of being truly seen. People don't just randomly become controlling, avoidant, emotionally unavailable, addicted to validation, addicted to chaos. Most behaviors are adaptations, protective mechanisms, survival responses shaped by pain. And once you understand that, you begin seeing humanity differently. You stop seeing only behavior and you start seeing wounds underneath that behavior. The angry person may be deeply ashamed. The narcissistic person may be spiritually empty. The people pleaser may be terrified of rejection. The hyper independent person may secretly feel unsafe relying on anyone. And suddenly life becomes less black and white, more psychological, more spiritual, more layered. And you realize most people are not consciously choosing who they are. They are just repeating patterns that they never examined. That's why awareness is so powerful. Awareness interrupts automatic living. Most people live on autopilot. You know that. Same thoughts, same emotional cycles, same fears, same reactions, day after day, year after year, entire lifetime spent unconsciously repeating themselves. And then one day something happens that shakes their soul awake. Maybe betrayal, maybe heartbreak, maybe isolation, maybe burnout, or maybe a spiritual experience that they can't explain. But suddenly they start seeing through that illusion that kept them asleep. And at first, it's terrifying because certainty starts dissolving. The old identity no longer fits. The old goals feel empty. The old relationships feel misaligned. Even conversations start feeling strange because you can hear how deeply conditioned most people are. And this is the stage where many people will feel alone, not because they're superior, but because awakening creates distance between you and those environments that were built around on unconscious patterns. You know, you stop enjoying fake interactions. You stop forcing connections that drain your spirit. You know, you stop shrinking yourself to make people, like emotionally immature people, more comfortable. You stop chasing approval. because you realize most approval is conditional anyways. People love masks. They love versions of you that benefit their comfort zone. But the moment you evolve, some people disappear because they were attached to who you used to be, not who you're truly becoming. That part hurts deeply because growth often requires grieving entire identities, entire dynamics, entire belief systems. And nobody really prepares people for that. They talk about manifestation and healing and spiritual awakening like it's all love and light and peace. But sometimes awakening feels like standing in the ruins of your old reality, trying to figure out who you are without that mask. Sometimes healing feels ugly before it feels freeing. Because before you become your authentic self, you usually become aware of how inauthentic you had to be to survive. And maybe that's why so many so many people feel disconnected from themselves. They adapted so deeply to external expectations that they lost all contact with their own intuition, their own spirit, their own inner voice. They became experts at reading everybody else while barely understanding themselves. And eventually the soul gets tired of that performance. That exhaustion you feel sometimes isn't always physical. Sometimes it's spiritual exhaustion. The exhaustion of pretending to enjoy things that no longer align, pretending to be okay when you're emotionally drowning, pretending to fit into spaces your spirit already outgrew, pretending to be that old version of yourself because other people are uncomfortable with your transformation. But transformation is part of the game too. Nothing stays fixed forever. Identities change, consciousness changes, perspectives change. And maybe the deepest freedom in life, it comes when you stop trying to control every outcome and you start learning how to consciously experience reality instead of unconsciously reacting to it. Because the illusion teaches people that control equals safety, but life constantly proves otherwise. Plans fail, people leave, circumstances change overnight. And eventually you realize peace cannot depend entirely on external stability because external reality is always shifting. That realization can either break people or awaken them. Some become bitter because reality didn't obey their expectations. Others become wiser because they finally understand life was never about controlling everything. It was about becoming conscious through the experience itself, you know, learning, evolving, expanding awareness. And maybe that's why some souls eventually stop obsessing over winning the game in the traditional sense. They stop chasing status as if it was salvation. They stop comparing their timeline to everybody else's. They stop measuring their worth through productivity alone. They begin valuing presence, peace, depth, authenticity, inner alignment. Because at the end of the day, what really matters if you gained the world but lost yourself in the process? You know, what's the point of being admired if nobody actually knows the real you? What's the point of success if your spirit feels dead inside your own life? Those are the questions awakening forces people to confront. And not everybody wants to confront them because truth changes things. Once you know your soul is starving, distractions stop satisfying you the same way. Once you realize your identity was partially constructed through fear and conditioning, you can't fully return to unconscious living again like you used to. And that's where a new phase begins. You stop trying to escape yourself and you start trying to understand yourself. You become more intentional about what you consume physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. You protect your energy differently. You choose relationships differently. You begin valuing honesty over image, depth over popularity, peace over performance. And strangely enough, the more authentic you become, the less you need constant external approval. It's true. Because you're no longer building your entire identity around how other people perceive you. And that doesn't mean your ego disappears completely. You see, ego is a part of human experience, but now you see it more clearly. You notice when comparison tries pulling you back into unconsciousness. You notice when fear tries convincing you to betray yourself just for acceptance. You notice when your wounds try reenacting old emotional patterns. Awareness becomes your power because awareness creates choice and choice breaks cycles. Maybe life really is a game, but not a game about domination, not a game about proving superiority. Maybe the real challenge is remembering who you really are underneath all the conditioning. Maybe the real challenge is staying conscious in a world designed to distract you from yourself. Maybe the real challenge is learning how to love without losing yourself, succeed without worshiping status, connect without performing, exist without constantly needing to prove your worth. And maybe the illusion finally breaks the moment you realize you were never supposed to become a perfect human being. You were supposed to become a conscious one. And this brings us to the end of the video. Hope you guys like the video. Hit that like button right now. Share it with one other person. Subscribe if you haven't. Until next time, love you guys. Take care.